right, so you're there in 2 Samuel chapter 3. And if you remember in chapter 2, we had the big battle at Gibeon where the house of David is going against the house of Saul. Obviously, Saul's dead, his sons are dead, but then Ishbosheth, or basically Abner, sets up Ishbosheth, which is the son of Saul, to be king over Israel. And there is basically that big war, that big battle that happens, and Asahel, Joab and Abishai's brother, is killed by Abner. If you remember, though, Abner didn't want to kill him. Basically, he's trying to give him every out that you can imagine to basically keep from doing that. But he wouldn't take it, and therefore Abner pretty much had to in order to not get killed himself. And so the battle ends, and then in chapter 3 here, in verse 1, it says, "Now there was long war between the house of Saul and the house of David." And what you have to understand is that Ishbosheth has said that he reigns for 2 years. Now, we're going to see in the next chapter that Ishbosheth is going to die. So at this point, there's a turn of events that happens with Abner and with Ishbosheth in this chapter. And so long war, I believe, is dealing with this 2-year period, if you will, of after Saul dies and Ishbosheth is reigning over Israel for those 2 years. But it says, "But David waxed stronger and stronger, and the house of Saul waxed weaker and weaker." And so basically, it's kind of like this: every battle, David's winning and Saul's losing, kind of thing, or his house is. So basically, it's a losing war for the house of Saul, and we saw that with the battle at Gibeon, because 19 men plus Asahel, so 20 men of David died, but it was like 360, I believe, or something like that. I think it was 360 men on the house of Saul's or Ishbosheth's men that died. So you can kind of see that's already happening, right? I mean, David is losing less men, so he's getting stronger, and Saul's house is getting weaker. Now, the thing that's interesting, or just kind of when I see that waxing stronger, waxing weaker, I just think about the idea of how Saul and David do kind of have an allegory of the Old Testament and New Testament as far as just that picture there. And I just think about Hebrews chapter 8, where it talks about how he's made the first covenant old. Now that which waxeth old is ready to vanish away. And that idea of how when the New Testament was established, it was obviously in a moment, when Jesus died, the veil of the temple was rent in twain, and we know that the death of the testator is the power of that testament, and that the New Testament started that moment, and the Old Testament ended at that moment as well. So what you have to understand is that obviously God is regarding David as king. He's not regarding Ishbosheth as king, but there is kind of like this time where it's still kind of there, right? There's still this kingdom that's kind of lingering, even though it's not really being regarded by God or anything like that. So it definitely, I think, correlates there as far as basically it's very obvious that Saul's house is done. It's basically just dwindling and waxing old and about to vanish away, as far as that kingdom is concerned, right? And so, but it's not just this immediate kind of like vanishing away. And people confuse that, though, with the New Testament, Old Testament, and think, well, the Old Testament's still in force, all this stuff. It's like they haven't been sacrificing since 70 A.D. or around that time. It's vanished away, okay? And what's remaining now of Judaism is just a Pharisaical Judaism that doesn't regard the Old Testament at all. So anyway, that being said, definitely see that in there, but we see that obviously David's kingdom is waxing stronger and stronger. And then in the beginning of the chapter here, it talks about basically all the sons that David had when he's in Hebron. So if you remember, he reigns in Hebron for 7 years and 6 months. So he reigns for a total of 40 years, right? And but it talks about the sons that were born to him while he's in Hebron. And so so look at verse 2 there, and the thing that I want you to see here is that there's 6 sons here, and there's 6 different women that he has them with. So when you look at Solomon later on, you can understand why Solomon probably has a problem with this. Because his father obviously had a huge problem with multiplying wives unto himself. And this is one of the commandments in Deuteronomy 17 about if you're to have a king, these are the things you're supposed to do. It's like David was really good about, I believe, having the law of the Lord and basically following the law of the Lord and knowing it. And obviously, the Bible talks about that when it comes to David. But when it comes to him not multiplying wives unto himself, he comes short. And I think sometimes we forget or we don't realize how many wives he actually had, because we think of obviously Michal, but then Abigail and Ahinoam, I think, I don't know how you say it, but Ahinoam or whatever. You think of those because those are mentioned earlier as far as those two wives that he has after Michal. Verse 2 here, just to read it, it says, And unto David were sons born in Hebron. The firstborn, his firstborn was Amnon of Ahinoam, and the Jezreelitess, and his second, Chileab of Abigail, the wife of Nabal, the Carmelite. So we kind of know them through the stories, right? As far as we're getting through that. Obviously, Abigail. But it says the third, Absalom, the son of Maacah, the daughter of Talmai, king of Geshur. Now that's going to be important dealing with Absalom as far as who his grandfather is. Okay, as far as his grandfather is the king of Geshur. That's kind of an important detail when you get into the story with Absalom and all that. But it says the fourth, Adonijah, the son of Haggith, and the fifth, Shephatiah, the son of Abital, and the sixth, Ithream, by Eglah, David's wife. These were born to David in Hebron. So basically, you have 6 different wives and 6 different sons. Okay, and Amnon, that's the story that's going to be coming up with Amnon. We have Absalom, the story with him and his brother Amnon. But you can see that they're half brothers, right? They're not full brothers when you look at these stories. And even Adonijah's comes up later on when it comes to Solomon. And obviously Adonijah's older because Solomon's not going to be born until they're in Jerusalem. And but I just want you to see that 6 different sons, 6 different women. And go to 1 Chronicles chapter 3. 1 Chronicles chapter 3. Because it recounts this, but it also shows us the sons that were born to him when he went to Jerusalem. Okay. And the thing that I want you, in 1 Chronicles 14, verse 3, it says, And David took more wives at Jerusalem, and David begat more sons and daughters. Okay, so basically, he has all these wives and all these sons from different women, and then when he goes to Jerusalem, eventually after 7.5 years, he's reigning in Jerusalem, he takes more wives unto himself, and he has more sons and daughters. And so he has 6 sons at this point. And it says in verse 1 of 1 Chronicles chapter 3, 1 Chronicles chapter 3 and verse 1, it says, Now these were the sons of David which were born unto him in Hebron. The firstborn Amnon of Ahinoam, the Jezreelitess. The second, Daniel. Now if you remember in 2 Samuel, it said Chileab. So obviously Daniel's another name that he has. And so no big deal there. But obviously if you're ever looking in a genealogy or something like that, it may say Daniel, it may say Chileab, of Abigail the Carmelitess. The third, Absalom, the son of Maacah, the daughter of Talmai, king of Geshur. The fourth, Adonijah, the son of Haggith. The fifth, Shephatiah of Abital. The sixth, Ithream, by Eglah, his wife. These 6 were born unto him in Hebron, and there he reigned 7 years and 6 months. And in Jerusalem he reigned 33 years. And these were born unto him in Jerusalem, Shimeah, and Shobab, and Nathan, and Solomon, 4 of Bathsheba, the daughter of Amiel. Now, Bathsheba is Bathsheba, okay? Because we know Solomon was born of Bathsheba. But the thing that's interesting with that is Nathan is born of her as well. And when you know the genealogies of Jesus, the genealogy of Joseph's genealogy has Solomon in it. It's that kingly line. But Mary's genealogy goes back to Nathan. And so either way you slice that, the son of Bathsheba is in that genealogy, whether if you're dealing with his physical flesh from Mary, or you're dealing with that kingly line, dealing with Joseph's line there. But we see here that 4 of his sons are born of her. And then Abhar also, and Elishama, and Eliphalet, and Noga, and Nepheg, and Shephiah, and Elishama, and Eliada, and Eliphalet, 9. So apparently Eliphalet was a popular name. So 9, not counting the 4 of Bathsheba. So you have 13 sons that were born to him in Jerusalem, right? And then you have the 6 sons there. So I mean, David has, just from this, 19 sons. And a lot of those are from different women and all of that. It says these were the sons of David. Notice this. Beside the sons of the concubines and Tamar, their sister. Now, the reason I believe they bring that up is because that's pertinent to the story with Absalom and all that. So that's Tamar is Absalom's sister. Okay. So that doesn't count as concubines. He has other sons, all of that. And so when you get to the story about David committing adultery, it's kind of like, yeah, you have a problem there. I mean, how many wives do you have to have? And this is a big problem. So anytime anybody's just like, well, you know, the Old Testament, they had multiple wives. Yeah, show me how that worked out well. Show me a good case where someone had multiple wives and everything worked out fine. And then show me a verse where God says he's okay with that. Now, obviously, I believe that God winked at that in the Old Testament, meaning this is that he didn't judge it as harshly as I believe he does now. And so, but the idea of polygamy or having multiple wives, obviously not good, obviously bad, and it's going to cause huge problems and all that. So, but going on from that, that's going to be an issue too when you think about in this story, he's going to get Michal, his first wife, back, and you just got to think to yourself, how many, really, you must have her back, and obviously the law talks about this. Now, I don't believe there's a bill of divorcement done or anything like that, but at the same time, she's married to another man, and then you're wanting her back. You have how many wives, David, Now, I think it was probably out of principle because she was taken away from him and given to someone else, and he's probably just like, you know what, I'm taking her back. So I understand that on that level, but anyway, going into this with Ishbosheth and Abner, there's going to be basically a feud between them, and it's actually going to be dealing with Saul's concubine. And so in 2 Samuel chapter 3 and verse 6, it says, "And it came to pass, while there was war between the house of Saul and the house of David, that Abner made himself strong for the house of Saul. And Saul had a concubine whose name was Rizpah, the daughter of Ahiah. And Ishbosheth said to Abner, Wherefore hast thou gone in unto my father's concubine?" Now, Abner's going to get really upset about this to the point where he basically turns the kingdom over to David. But you have to understand that I don't think Ishbosheth is probably out of line with what's going on here, because you think about the fact that Abner, what I say with this, I think he has a reason why he's saying this to him, because it prefaces this with Abner, it made himself strong for the house of Saul. Meaning this is that if you know the story of Adonijah, that comes later, well, actually that'll be in 1 Kings, so I guess we won't be getting to that in this study. But the story of Adonijah is that when Solomon was made king, Adonijah asked for Abishag, the Shunammite, which wasn't necessarily David's concubine. And he didn't, basically she was a virgin, all this stuff. But basically Solomon's like, ask for him the kingdom. Why don't you, right? Basically, the idea of doing that is symbolistic of basically taking over control. Think about how Absalom, what's he do when David leaves? He goes into David's concubines. And so this is kind of like symbolistic of basically taking control. Now, what you have to understand too is that who set up Ishbosheth to be king to begin with? Abner. And after this whole discussion here, we're going to see that Ishbosheth is afraid of Abner. So who really has the power in this? When you're going to war, who's going to war? Abner. Abner's going to war. It's his men. And it doesn't even mention Ishbosheth most of the time. It just basically says the house of Saul. So Ishbosheth is not really holding the reins. And this is kind of you can see how he's kind of being pushed out of power. And so he's upset with Abner about this. And then Abner just snaps back at him. Now, this could also be the fact that Abner's wrong in what he's doing. And this is typical of someone that does something wrong. And when they're called out for it, they lash out, right? So I kind of see that as well where, it doesn't say he married this woman, right? I mean, Saul's not alive, right? So this woman is obviously free from any type of marriage or anything like that. But it doesn't say that he married her or anything like that. It just said he went in unto her. So, that's not right, as far as that's concerned. And so this is typical of someone that commits sin that's called out for it or they're caught in it, that they just typically lash out and just start, getting angry about it. Instead of saying, yeah, you're right, this is wrong, whatever. So in verse 8 there it says, Then was Abner very wroth for the words of Ishbosheth, and said, Am I a dog's head, which against Judah do show kindness this day unto the house of Saul thy father, to his brethren and to his friends, and have not delivered thee into the hand of David, that thou chargest me today with a fault concerning this woman? So he's basically like, all I've done for you, basically is what he's saying. It's like, I've done all this for you, and you're going to basically bring this in my face. And so, obviously Ishbosheth, even if he's, I think that Abner's at fault, but you're also dealing with the man that's basically keeping you safe from David, the one that's basically fighting all your battles, and then you're pointing this out to him. Now, verse 9, it says, So do God to Abner, and more also, except as the Lord has sworn to David, even so I do to him. That's strong. Now, what did God swear to David? Well, that his kingdom would have no end, right? I mean, and obviously it goes even deeper than that, that basically it says that I will sit upon his throne, meaning like the Lord is saying, and in the New Testament talks about it says, of the fruit of his loins, he set Christ to be on his throne. And so obviously he's sworn to David that, and Abner's basically saying, the Lord swore to him, so do I. So basically this just turned the tide. It made me think of just how sometimes people's sins, like God can use like sinners in different situations to turn the tide on certain issues or certain things that would go his direction. I think of the King James Bible, and I think about the Bible being translated into English. And if you remember, people were being burned at the stake for translating the Bible into English, right? But what turned the tide to that? Henry VIII, and the fact that he wanted a divorce, and the Catholic Church wouldn't allow it. And so he separated from the Catholic Church and made the Church of England, which in turn turned the tide to wanting it in English and separating from the Latin Vulgate and the Catholic Church and all that stuff. And so it just kind of makes me think of that a little bit, and the fact that Abner over here lying with Saul's concubine turned the whole war. I wouldn't say turned the war around. They were already being defeated. But at the same time, it really just stopped everything. The battle was done because of that. So it's just interesting how history will do that, or how God can use those certain things and everything to end battles and all that. So in verse 10 there, it says, to translate the kingdom from the house of Saul, to set up the throne to David over Israel and over Judah, from Dan even to Beersheba, and he could not answer Abner a word again because he feared him. And really that's what it comes down to, is that the king isn't always the one that's in ultimate power. And our government's supposed to be set up to that it's we the people, so those that are governing officials should be fearing the people. Now it's not that way, obviously nowadays, but that's the way it should be, right? And you'll see this throughout the Bible, that different kingdoms will have the king will have a certain amount of authority. It's not just like you're a king and you have ultimate authority. Now, Nebuchadnezzar had that. Nebuchadnezzar was kind of like that king of kings, ultimate authority, whatever you said went. But when you got down to, let's say, Darius, that actually the law, he couldn't go against his own laws. And even if he made the law, he couldn't go against it. It can't be changed, can't be altered, even by the king. And so that's where you get the story of, Daniel in the den of lions, and the fact that he made this decree not knowing it was going to affect Daniel, and then when it did, he couldn't do anything to change it, even though he's the king. So that being said, power, in a lot of cases, it has to do with who has the power. And you think about Abner and the fact that he has the host of the army. So he commands the army. Who really has the power at that point? So obviously Ishbosheth doesn't have anything to say to him. But you'll see this phrase too, from Dan to Beersheba. So if you think about like a map, Beersheba's on the lower portion of Israel, and then Dan's up north. And you'll see that where northern kingdom of Israel, where do they put the golden calves when Jeroboam takes over? Dan and Bethel, right? And they're up north. And then Beersheba's always down here in Judah and all of that. So from Dan to Beersheba would be kind of like us saying from the east coast to the west coast, right? From coast to coast. That's kind of what's being said there. It's just basically a catch-all, like all of Israel from Dan to Beersheba, okay? So going on from that, Abner, not bluffing, so he sends out messengers to David to basically say, I'm going to translate the kingdom over to you. And so in verse 12 here, it says, and Abner sent messengers to David on his behalf, saying, whose is the land? Saying also, make thy league with me, and behold, my hand shall be with thee, to bring about all Israel unto thee. And he said, well, I will make a league with thee, but one thing I require of thee, that is, that thou shalt not see my face, except thou first bring Michal, Saul's daughter, when thou comest to see my face. So he's basically saying, great, but you must bring Michal with you. And it says, and David sent messengers to Ishbosheth, Saul's son, saying, deliver me my wife, Michal, which I espoused to me for 100 foreskins of the Philistines. Now you may say, well, I thought it was 200 foreskins. No, that's what it was. The tally of what his dowry was 100 foreskins. The fact that he brought 200 foreskins was just bonus, right? Because people try to look at it and be like, it's a contradiction. He did 200. Now, just because you give it above and beyond doesn't mean that wasn't the price, okay? The price was 100, not 200. And just because you give above and beyond, it doesn't change what the actual price was, okay? So no problem there. It's just the fact that David's an overachiever, right? So, but basically it's very clear, same wife, same woman. He's like, basically I paid the dowry, she's my wife, and bring her to me. And Ishbosheth sent and took her from her husband, even from Phaltiel, the son of Laish. And her husband went with her along, weeping behind her to Bahurim. Then said Abner unto him, go and return, and he returned. So it's a horrible story, but I'll say this. You may look at the husband and be like, that's sad. But he also knew that David was married to her, right? So it's hard to be really upset about that, right? I mean, if you knew that someone was married to somebody and they're on the run and Saul's after them, and then he's like, hey, I'm going to give you my daughter to wife that was married to David, like, you know what you're getting into, right? I mean, for him not to know, you say, well, maybe he didn't know. David, who killed Goliath, like he's not only famous, but now at this point he's infamous because he's like enemy number one of Israel. And he married the king's daughter. There's no way this guy did not know that was David's wife. Okay, so, you could look at this and be like, that's sad, he's weeping and all that stuff, but at the same time, you reap what you sow. Like, don't marry someone else's wife. So, anyway, I know I remember reading that. I'm just like, that'd be kind of sad, But at the same time, like, what are you doing? Like, what were you doing to begin with, marrying this woman? So, Michal, actually, that's a very tragic story, when you think about that, right? Because she marries David, and then her father basically wants to kill him all this time. Then David leaves and then just starts marrying all these other women and just leaves her, right? Leaves her back at home, just goes off, starts marrying other women, having children with other women, and then says, hey, bring me back my wife. And then she loses that husband, comes back to David, and then David, when he brings the Ark of the Covenant back in, basically they get into this big fight, and then she doesn't have any children. You notice that you won't see, basically children from her, or at least after that point, right? But the thing is that just kind of like this tragic story of Michal, who lost her whole family, lost her husband, all that stuff. It's a horrible kind of situation for her. So, and if you think about it, I mean, what has she really done in the story is wrong? And you say, well, she was like saying to David, you defiled yourself among the women of Israel. It's like, can you really blame her for being jealous about her husband dancing in front of women when he's married how many women at this point? Like, I can completely understand where she's coming. I'm not saying that she was right, because obviously he's dancing before the Lord, but at the same time, like, you look at that and you're like, think about where she's at, okay, and understand that. So anyway, I know I'm getting ahead of myself with the story coming up with the Ark of the Covenant coming in and everything, but this whole thing is just kind of really sad to me for her sake. The guy, Phaltiel, I don't really have sympathy for him. I used to read through here. I kind of had some sympathy for him. I don't. Don't marry someone else's wife. That's the lesson. Okay, get over it. But Michal, I have sympathy for her. That's a horrible situation. All that. So, but going on from that, so he returns. It says in verse 17, it says, and Abner had communication with the elders of Israel, saying, ye sought for David in times past to be king over you. So basically, Abner's like this spokesperson to Israel now. He's basically, like you said, he's going to translate the kingdom to David, meaning he is going to basically be the earpiece to tell everybody why they should follow David. It says in verse 18, now then do it, for the Lord hath spoken of David, saying, by the hand of my servant David, I will save my people Israel out of the hand of the Philistines and out of the hand of all their enemies. Now, what's interesting about this is that they all know this. You notice when you're reading through these stories, Saul knew that. Like, he knew that. Jonathan knew that. Abigail knew that. Like, everybody in Israel knew that God was saying David was to be king. David was going to save them out of the hands of the Philistines. David was that rightful king. Everybody knew it. Abner knew it that whole time. So it's not like David's like, here's what you say to everybody. Abner already knew what. I mean, and even when he's talking to Ishbosheth, he says, as the Lord sware to David, so do I. Meaning that he already knew that the Lord has sworn to David about his kingdom and about his throne. So it's just really interesting to me about how they all knew this. It's like this well-known secret. Have you ever heard that phrase, like a well-known secret? Where it's like no one really talks about it, but everybody knows it's true. Everybody knows what's going on. And that's basically what was going on. When David was anointed king, it was just this well-known secret that David was to be king. He's the one that God chose, all of that. Back when he was a lad, back before he even killed Goliath, God chose him to be king. And all of Israel already knows that. And he's basically just voicing that to all of Israel. Verse 19, it says, and Abner also spake in the ears of Benjamin. Now, Benjamin, he's not talking about a person, but the tribe of Benjamin, right? Now, why is that important? Because that's who Saul's of. Saul is of, the son of Kish of the tribe of Benjamin. And so particularly, if you think about it, who would he have to convince the most? the tribe in which their king, that Saul came out of. Okay, just as much as they're going to convince them that David wouldn't be king, who are they going to have to convince? Judah. They're going to have to convince them for that to be any other way. So, basically, he speaks into the ears of Benjamin, and it says, Abner went also to speak in the ears of David in Hebron all that seemed good to Israel, that seemed good to the whole house of Benjamin. Now, the other thing I was thinking about with that, too, is the fact that well-known secret, if you will, is kind of like what you think about with the Old Testament. Like, everybody knew that you can't be saved by the law, and that it's by faith. Even though Israel stumbled at that stumbling stone, that they were trying to obtain righteousness by the law, but it was always this kind of like backdrop of knowing that, okay? Whereas the New Testament is very clear on that. It's very plain and revealed that it's not by the law, it's by faith and all of that. But it's not like it wasn't known beforehand. It just may have been a little less revealed as it is now. So, but it says in verse 20, it says, So Abner came to David to Hebron, and 20 men with him, and David made Abner and the men that were with him a feast. And Abner said unto David, I will arise and go, and will gather all Israel unto my lord the king, that they may make a league with thee, and that thou mayest reign over all that thine heart desireth. And David sent Abner away, and he went in peace. So at this point, it's kind of like everything's looking up, right? Everything's looking up. It's like, oh, okay, basically Abner, the captain of the host of their adversary, basically is going around telling everybody, hey, it's time. It goes to David. And basically, when you have the captain of the host, that's the general of the army basically saying, no, it's David's kingdom. It's time to, basically get under the king, right? And David, meets up with them, makes them a feast, and he leaves in peace. And at this point, it'd be kind of like, worries are over. Everything's done until Joab comes onto the scene, okay? So this is where everything kind of goes awry because, Joab wasn't there, okay? So that's what we find out in verse 22. Now, here's the thing. We just got done with chapter 2 where Asahel was killed by Abner. Okay, so know that that's pretty fresh in Joab's mind and Abishai's mind. It's not like I fault Joab for being upset with Abner and wanting vengeance and all that, right? I can understand that on a fleshly level. But basically, he's just like destroying this peace treaty between Israel and Judah and between, David and the house of Saul by what he's doing here. And in verse 22, it says, And behold, the servants of David and Joab came from pursuing a troop and brought in a great spoil with them. So basically, Joab wasn't there, and it's kind of like Abner leaves, and then Joab comes back. And it says, But Abner was not with David in Hebron, for he had sent him away, and he was gone in peace. So basically, it's just stating that Abner was already gone by the time Joab got back to where David was at. When Joab and all the host that was with him were come, they told Joab, saying, Abner, son of Ner, came to the king, and he hath sent him away, and he is gone in peace. So he's basically like, he comes back, and he hears that Abner was there, and that basically David just sent him away in peace. And so, now, whether Joab knew all the information at hand, sometimes you come into a situation, and you just kind of hear, like, this person was here, but you don't know why. You don't hear like the whole story, and maybe to Joab he's just like, what in the world? Abner, our adversary, came into the camp. He just sent him away in peace. So it says in verse 24, it said, Then Joab came to the king and said, What hast thou done? Behold, Abner came unto thee. Why is it that thou hast sent him away, and he is quite gone? And then it says, Thou knowest Abner the son of Ner, that he came to deceive thee, and to know thy going out and thy coming in, and to know all that thou doest. Now, he's obviously coming into this with a bias. He's coming into this kind of hot and heavy on this, right? Meaning this is that we know from the Bible that Abner wasn't coming in to deceive. Abner was very sincere. Like, he already told Ishbosheth what he was going to do. And he swore to the Lord that, basically he's going to do this. I don't think there's anything about him trying to deceive this. There's nothing that indicates that he was just coming in there to get David off his guard, okay? Joab's coming in there hot because he hates Abner, and he wants to kill Abner. Now, this is a lesson when it comes to people that you may not like, and maybe you're not in good friendship with, or maybe you just don't like certain people, right? And I'm talking about Christians. Like, there's certain Christian people maybe you don't like or whatever, and it's easy sometimes to just basically be ready to destroy somebody no matter what they do, right? And just kind of be on a hair trigger to be like ready for someone to make a mistake, right? And I've seen this happen many times where it's like you don't like this person. It's like it doesn't matter. They do something wrong and it's just like crucify them for it. Whereas if it was someone that you liked, you're going to give them a little more leeway. And we got to be very careful that we're not a respecter of persons when it comes to that, right? If you would give like your good friend leeway in that area, then you need to give your enemy leeway as well, right? Because that really gets into loving your enemy and the fact of, not just be on just ready to wait. You're just waiting for them to make a mistake. Well, we all make mistakes. We're all going to make mistakes, so just wait longer. Just wait a certain amount of time, and that person you don't like will make a mistake. Guaranteed. And so we have to be very careful of that because we don't want to be those type of people that are just like waiting to just like tear someone down just because we don't like them. And I always think about this. If someone you don't like, does something out of line or does something you don't like, I picture it being like a family member or someone you do like. And then ask yourself, how would you deal with that? How would you speak to that person? How would you deal with that situation? And that's how you should deal with it, right? And so, and again, this is for all of us because it's easy, especially if you don't like somebody, you're just like, that person, I just really can't stand that person. Especially if it's a Christian, we shouldn't want Christians to fail, even if we don't particularly like them, okay? You need to love your brother, doesn't mean you need to like him. Meaning this is, what I mean by that, because you're like, how does that make sense? How can you love somebody and not like them? Well, you don't have to be friends with every single person, right? Every single Christian that's out there, you don't have to be friends with them. Every pastor out there, you don't have to be friends with them. You don't have to like every pastor. You don't have to like every Christian. But I'll say this is that treat everybody with the same respect and basically don't be a respecter of persons, right? Don't respect a friend over an enemy when it comes to how you deal with judgment, for example. Like if you're going to deal out judgment, make it fair. Would you deal that same way with your friend, or would you deal that differently with your friend? And if you would give more grace to your friend, then you should give the same grace to the enemy. And that's hard, isn't it? That's something that's going to be hard to do, which is why it's, the Bible does say to love your brother, but at the same time, it's kind of like, if you love them that love you, what thank have you? For even the Gentiles and the heathen and the publicans do the same. But if you love those that despise you, then have your reward. Okay, so that's just something that I kind of see here with Joab, that he's just understandably, not liking Abner, but he's also throwing out railing accusations, isn't he? Because Abner didn't come to deceive. He didn't come just to see you're going in and coming out. He came in because before he even got there to talk to David, was already speaking to Benjamin and all these other people about bringing the kingdom over to David, before he even got there and ate the feast. So the accusation that Joab's bringing up is false. And obviously, Joab's just mad because he wanted to kill him, right? That's really what it comes down to. He wanted to kill Abner. He's mad that David sent him away in peace. And, he's going to end up murdering Abner. So go to verse 26 here. So in verse 26 it says, in 2 Samuel chapter 3 and verse 26, and when Joab was come out from David, he sent messengers after Abner, which brought him again from the well of Sirah, but David knew it not. Okay, so basically, this kind of reminds me of the Gehazi story, where basically, if you remember, Naaman the Syrian basically said, I'll give you whatever, change the garment, whatever, I'll give you money, and Elisha's like, no, just be on your way. And Gehazi goes after him and says, hey, actually, I will take some of that stuff, right? And so, but this is a case where he's sending out messengers. David doesn't know about it. And it says, and when Abner was returned to Hebron, so basically he comes back, Joab took him aside in the gate to speak with him quietly, and smote him there under the 5th rib, that he died for the blood of Asahel, his brother. Now, do you remember how Abner killed Asahel? With the back end of his spear, and he killed him under the 5th rib. So literally, Joab is killing him in the same manner that his brother was killed by Abner. So it's kind of like this, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. You're going to be killed the same exact way. And it says, and afterward, when David heard it, he said, I and my kingdom are guiltless before the Lord forever from the blood of Abner the son of Ner. Let it rest on the head of Joab and on all his father's house. And let there not fail from the house of Joab one that hath an issue, or that is a leper, or that leaneth on a staff, or that falleth on the sword, or that lacketh bread. That's quite a curse there that David's putting upon him. But he's making a point that this was not of David. Because what you have to understand is that, what does everybody else see? Right? Abner comes to him with a treaty of peace, and then he's killed while he's there. Okay? And it said, now the interesting thing about this is that it says in verse 30, so Joab and Abishai, his brother, slew Abner, because he had slain their brother Asahel at Gibeon in the battle. So Abishai was there. Now, we already know that messengers went to go get Abner, but this is a case, too, where you're reading a story and you'll see Joab kills him and stabs him under the 5th rib, but Abishai was also involved in this. And so sometimes you'll see a story where it's like one person does something. It doesn't mean there aren't other people there. It doesn't mean that something else wasn't going on, or, whatever. But the Bible later on states Abishai also slew him. So whatever was going on there, maybe Abishai was, dealing with the messengers, and somehow he orchestrated how to bring back Abner to talk to him. Because it talks about how he went aside quietly. Maybe Abishai, basically did something to kind of distract everybody else, so they go over there. And you say, well, who actually killed, did they both stab him at the same time? Listen, you don't have to be the one necessarily to stab him to be associated with the murderer, okay? You can be an accomplice. I mean, also, just if you indirectly murder somebody, like David with Uriah, it's put on his account that he's the one that murdered him, right? Thou hast slayed Uriah with the sword of Ammon. So Abishai was obviously involved. It seems like Joab was the one that was actually kind of pulling the trigger, if you will. But Abishai was involved in the murder. He was obviously an accomplice, if anything, but probably involved in, the actual action as well, maybe as well. So anyway, this is brought up later on when Solomon is reigning, meaning this is that David doesn't kill Joab for this, but he tells Solomon to. Okay, notice what it says here in 1 Kings chapter 2. 1 Kings chapter 2. 1 Kings chapter 2, because this story gets brought up. And David is drawing nigh unto death, and he's charging Solomon, his son. And he's basically giving him all these different charges. And he's bringing up certain people and all of that. And in verse 5 there, so 1 Kings chapter 2 and verse 5, it says, moreover, thou knowest also what Joab the son of Zeruiah did to me, and what he did to the 2 captains of the host of Israel, unto Abner the son of Ner, and unto Amasa the son of Jether, whom he slew. Now, we haven't got to that story, but Amasa is his cousin. That's Joab's cousin, and he slays him with the end of the 5th rib as well. And now what you have to understand is that at this point, they're not at war. Amasa wasn't at war when this was all going on. It says, whom he slew and shed the blood of war and peace, and put the blood of war upon his girdle that was about his loins, and in the shoes that were on his feet. Meaning this is that it was a time of peace. I mean, they'd already sent him away peace. There was a peace treaty. There was a league that was made, and he killed him when they were not at war. Okay, which shows you that there is a difference between killing outside of war and during war. There's a time of peace, and there's a time of war and a time of peace. There's a time to kill, and there's a time to heal. And like when soldiers come back from the war, they don't come back and just be killing everybody and be like, well, I'm a soldier. It's like, no, you can't do that. Like that's murder. Okay. And not saying murder can't happen out on the battlefield, because David's a case of that, right? Uriah was at war, but David murdered him. Okay, so there's cases where during a time of war, someone can be murdered as well. Okay, so that's not to say that just everything is allowed at war. Okay, but going on from that, it says, "Do therefore according to thy wisdom, and let not his whorehead go down to the grave in peace." This is where Benaiah the son of Jehoiada just cleans house. So that's another sermon for another day, but that's Solomon's man right there that just basically just cleans house and just kills everybody that's an adversary. But Joab is going to he's not going to go to the grave, meaning this, he's not going to die of natural causes. He's going to be basically executed. And it takes a long time before it finally is carried out, but it will happen. Okay? And so Joab will be killed for that, for murdering not only Abner, but also Amasa. Okay, and that comes later. Now, what you have to think here is that this obviously doesn't look well, but I don't think what David does next, I don't think has anything to do with the kingdom being translated or anything like that. I think he's just making a point that, one, he's mourning Abner because he cared for Abner. I mean, I don't think that when you look at this where he mourns for Abner, I don't look at it as like he's trying to make a point to Israel that, hey, this wasn't of me or anything like that. He's just mourning for Abner because basically a man was murdered that he made a peace treaty with, and obviously Abner was the captain of the host, just as much as Saul was the king of Israel, and he mourned for Saul, even though Saul was his enemy. But even more so, if you think about it, when your enemy then becomes your friend and then they're murdered, like that's a whole nother deal there. You can imagine that he probably really appreciated Abner for what he was doing on top of that. But in verse 31 it says, "And David said to Joab and to all the people that were with him, rend your clothes and gird you with sackcloth and mourn before Abner." And King David himself followed the bier. Now the bier is obviously, if you think about when Jesus raises the young man from the dead, it says he touches the bier. Now it's just kind of like a term for what they're carrying the dead body on and everything. Think of it like a casket or something like that, right? But it says, so notice that he says to Joab, and to all the people, right? He's making a point. You put on sackcloth too. You mourn for Abner, right? He's kind of pushing him to, because obviously, do you think Joab's upset that Abner's dead? No, I'm sure he's like rejoicing that Abner's dead, okay? But he's forcing Joab to mourn for Abner. And it says, and King David himself followed the bier, and they buried Abner in Hebron. And the king lifted up his voice and wept at the grave of Abner, and all the people wept. And the king lamented over Abner and said, "Died Abner as a fool dieth?" Because you think about it, I mean, think about how like mighty men of valor have died, where it's kind of like, that's how I go, right? I mean, you can think about dying in a matter of like in glory, and like there's this massive battle goes on, and you're taken out, right? Because you imagine like Jonathan and Saul, they kind of die in this glorious state of like they were fighting the battle of Israel, they die on the battlefield, right? Abner didn't die that way. Abner died by being deceived by someone that's supposed to be of his own nation, and after he made a league of peace, and he basically just killed in an alleyway, pretty much. It's just kind of like this, stupid way to die, right? Kind of like as a fool dieth. And you think about how fools could die. Just think about how do stupid people die, right? And that's kind of where you're kind of coming to with Abner, is that you kind of die just like some foolish person would die. It says, thy hands were not bound, nor thy feet put into fetters. As a man falleth before wicked men, so fellest thou. And all the people wept again over him. So notice this. David, one, curses Joab and his whole house. Then he says that it's wicked men that did this, right? So he's not defending Joab, Abishai. These are his men, right? So, these are his mighty men. When you look at David's mighty men, we'll get to eventually in this book, Joab, Abishai, and Asahel are among those mighty men. They're some of the top ones. Like Joab and Abishai are like in this top list, not the three mightiest, okay, because no one could attain to them apparently. But basically, Joab and Abishai are up there in like the top three below that, okay, and so they're very much like his right hand men when it comes to battle, and he is condemning them hardcore. Right, he's not giving them a pass or whatever, just because, and their family on top of that. So he's cursing his own flesh and blood, and he's calling them wicked. And this is what should happen, okay? Because you shouldn't hate somebody. You shouldn't treat someone differently or give false accusations or railing accusations just because you don't like the person. And you shouldn't be basically easy on somebody just because they're family. So, this is the right way to kind of deal with this, okay? It says in verse 35, and when all the people came to cause David to eat meat while it was yet day, David sware, saying, so do God to me, and more also, if I taste bread or aught else till the sun be down. And all the people took notice of it, and it pleased them, as whatsoever the king did pleased all the people. Now that's quite a phrase, isn't it? Now what it means here is that David is basically like, I'm fasting, and basically that phrase kind of like, so do God to me and more also, is something that's used a lot in the Old Testament. But basically it's kind of like making a curse upon yourself if you do other than what you're about to do, okay? And they noticed it, but the thing that they noticed basically, obviously, that he's distraught and that he did not want Abner to die. This was not of his doing. But the simple fact that it says, whatsoever the king did pleased all the people, is quite a phrase to be said. And that really shows you that they really did love David and that they were basically ready to follow him wherever he went. And it says in verse 37, for all the people and all Israel understood that day that it was not of the king to slay Abner the son of Ner. So that's good news, right? It's kind of like he dodged a bullet there, because basically Joab is completely trying to annihilate. Obviously he just wants to kill Abner, right? To him, it's just like, it's all about killing Abner. It has nothing to do with the kingdom or David's, future there. So, but it says that all Israel understood that day. So all of Israel understood this was not of David. This was not what David wanted. And it says in verse 38, and the king said unto his servants, know ye not that there is a prince and a great man fallen this day in Israel? Kind of same thing that he talks about the mighty are fallen with Saul and with Jonathan, right? And how are the mighty fallen? It says in verse 39, and I am this day weak, though anointed king. These men, the sons of Zeruiah, be too hard for me. The Lord shall reward the doer of evil according to his wickedness. And notice that he's basically putting it on the Lord to deal with Joab and to deal with, Abishai. And ultimately, David has Solomon take care of it, right? He has his son take care of it. And Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, is really the one that's going to end up doing that. And so, this is really another testament to David's love for his enemies, and also how it works both ways, that he's not just giving special treatment to to family or friends. Okay, and that's really what we need to think. The Bible talks about this, to not rest the poor in judgment. But it also says, like, basically it works both ways. Don't, whether rich or poor, right? Because don't just, like, basically favor the poor, right? And so someone's poor, therefore, like, the judgment will be softer because they're poor. Or over here, they're rich, so the judgment's going to be harder. Or the other way around, be like, well, they're rich, they're gonna give me something out of this, so I'll be good to them. And then the poor, well, what can they do for me? Nuts to them, right? Either way you go about it, it should be fair judgment. And that's where we get that kind of idea of justice is blind, right? And you have, that kind of symbol of the woman with the balances, with the blindfold on over her eyes, right? The idea is that it shouldn't matter. The law is what it is. Justice is what it is. It doesn't matter who you are. And what that really comes down to is not being a respecter of persons. It's just, the law is what it is. The punishment is what it is. It doesn't matter if you're family. It doesn't matter, it is what it is. And that's hard to do, right? Because it's easy to want to condemn your enemy, and it's easy to want to favor, friends and family and people you love, right? But really, justice needs to be blind. It needs to be the fact that it's across the board. The law is what it is. The punishment is what it is, and all of that. So, this is definitely an interesting chapter with Abner and with Joab and all that. And the next chapter we'll be getting into what happens with Ishbosheth. Obviously, he only reigns for 2 years. It is interesting to me that David is still in Hebron for, another 5.5 years, if you will, or something, give or take, right? When it says he reigned for 2 years, it doesn't mean like 2 years to the dot, right? But at the same time, let's say 5 years that he's still in Hebron. It's just interesting to me on that transition of, even after Ishbosheth dies, that there's still kind of this waiting to bring him into Jerusalem and all that. So, but interesting stories here. And all that. Let's end with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for today. Thank you for the book of 2 Samuel. Pray you help us to understand it. Help us to correlate these passages to make it practical in our lives. Obviously, interesting stories, fun stories to read. But, Lord, just help us to apply them to our lives. Help us to love our enemies, Lord. And specifically, I think of our enemies that are believers that maybe we don't like or whatever, Lord, that we don't just try to go after them, but also that we don't show favor above to those that maybe we love as far as judgment is concerned. So, Lord, help us to be not respecter of persons. Help us to judge rightly and righteously. And, Lord, we love you and pray also in Jesus Christ's name. Amen.